Chapter 30 of The Imperialist by Sara Jeannette Duncan. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. The Milburns' doorbell rang very early the morning of the election. The family and Alfred Hesketh were just sitting down to breakfast. Mr. Hesketh was again the guest of the house. He had taken a run out to Vancouver with Mr. Milburn's partner, who had gone to settle a point or two in connection with the establishment of a branch there. The points had been settled, and Hesketh, having learned more than ever, had returned to Elgin. The maid came back into the room with a conscious air, and said something in a low voice to Dora, who flushed and frowned a little, and asked to be excused. As she left the room, a glance of intelligence passed between her and her mother. While Miss Milburn was generally thought to be most like her father, both in appearance and disposition, there were points upon which she could count on an excellent understanding with her other parent. "Oh, Lorne," she said, having carefully closed the drawing-room door, "what in the world have you come here for, to-day of all days? Did anybody see you?" The young man, standing tall and broad-shouldered before the mantelpiece, had yet a look of expecting reproach. "I don't know," he said humbly. "I don't think father would like it," Dora told him, "if he knew you were here. Why, we're having an early breakfast on purpose to let him get out and work for winter. I never saw him so excited over an election. To think of your coming to-day!" He made a step toward her. "I came because it is to-day," he said. "Only for a minute, dear. It's a great day for me, you know, whether we win or lose. I wanted you to be in it. I wanted you to wish me good luck." "But you know I always do," she objected. "Yes, I know. But a fellow likes to hear it, Dora. On the day, you know. And I've seen so little of you lately." She looked at him measuringly. "You're looking awfully thin," she exclaimed, with sudden compunction. "I wish you had never got into this horrid campaign. I wish they had nominated somebody else." Lorne smiled half bitterly. "I shouldn't wonder if a few other people wished the same thing," he said. "But I'm afraid they'll have to make the best of it now." Dora had not sanctioned his visit by sitting down, and as he came nearer to her she drew a step away, moving by instinct from the capture of the lover. But he had made little of that, and almost as he spoke was at her side. She had to yield her hands to him. "Well, you'll win it for them if anybody could," she assured him. "Say, win it for us, dear." She shook her head. "I'm not a Liberal yet," she said, laughing. "It's only a matter of time." "I'll never be converted to grit politics." "No, but you'll be converted to me," he told her, and drew her nearer. "I'm going now, Dora. I dare say I shouldn't have come. Every minute counts to-day. Good-bye." She could not withhold her face from his asking lips, and he had bent to take his privilege when a step in the hall threatened and divided them. "It's only Mr. Hesketh going upstairs," said Dora, with relief. "I thought it was father. Oh, Lorne, fly!" "Hesketh?" Young Murchison's face clouded. "Is he working for winter, too?" "Lorne, what a thing to ask when you know he believes in your ideas. But he's a Conservative at home, you see, so he says he's in an awkward position, and he has been taking perfectly neutral ground lately. He hasn't a vote, anyway." "No," said Lorne, "he's of no consequence." The familiar easy step in the house of his beloved, the house he was being entreated to leave with all speed, struck upon his heart and his nerves. She, with her dull surface to the more delicate vibrations of things, failed to perceive this, or perhaps she would have thought it worth while to find some word to bring back his peace. She disliked seeing people unhappy. When she was 5 years old and her kitten broke its leg, she had given it to a servant to drown. He took his hat, making no further attempt to caress her, and opened the door. "I hope you will win, Lorne," she said, half resentfully, and he, with forced cheerfulness, replied, "Oh, we'll have a shot at it." Then, with a little silent nod at her, which, notwithstanding her provocations, conveyed his love and trust, he went out into the struggle of the day. In spite of Squire Ormiston's confident prediction, it was known that the fight would be hottest among the townships in Moneda Reservation. Elgin itself, of course, would lead the van for excitement, would be the real theatre for the arts of practical politics, but things would be pretty warm in Moneda too. It was for that reason that Bingham and the rest strongly advised Lorne not to spend too much of the day in the town, but to get out to Moneda early, and to drive around with Ormiston, stick to him like a fly to poison paper. "You leave Elgin to your friends," said Bingham. "Just show your face here and there, wearing a smile of triumph, to encourage the crowd, but don't worry about the details. We'll attend to them." "We can't have him upsetting his own election by any interference with the boys," said Bingham to Horace Williams. "He's got too long a nose for all kinds of things to be comfortable in town to-day. He'll do a great deal less harm trotting round the reserve, braced up against old Ormiston." So Elgin was left to the capable hands of "the boys" for the furtherance of the liberal interest and the sacred cause of imperialism. Mr. Farquharson, whose experience was longer, and whose nose presumably shorter than the candidates, never abandoned the town ward. Bingham skirmished between the polling booths and the committee room. Horace Williams was out all day. Rawlins edited the paper. The returns wouldn't be ready in time for anything but an extra anyhow, and the "Stand to Arms, South Fox" leader had been written 2 days ago. The rest was millinery, or might be for all anybody would read of it. The other side had a better idea of the value of their candidate than to send him into the country. Walter Winter remained where he was most effective and most at home. He had a neat little livery outfit, and he seemed to spend the whole day in it, accompanied by intimate personal friends, who had never spoken to him, much less driven with him, before. 2 or 3 strangers arrived the previous night at the leading hotels. Their business was various, but they had one point in common: they were very solicitous about their personal luggage. I should be sorry to assign their politics, and none of them seem to know much about the merits of the candidates, so they are not perhaps very pertinent, except for the curiosity shown by the public at the spectacle of gentlemen carrying their own bags when there were porters to do it. It was a day long remembered and long quoted. The weather was spring-like, sun after a week's thaw. It was pleasant to be abroad in the relaxed air and the drying streets, that here and there sent up threads of steam after the winter house-cleaning of their wooden sidewalks. Voting was a privilege never unappreciated in Elgin, and to-day the weather brought out every soul to the polls. The ladies of his family waiting in many instances on the veranda, with shawls over their heads, to hear the report of how the fight was going. Abby saw Dr. Harry back in his consulting room, and Dr. Henry safely off to vote, and then took the 2 children and went over to her father's house, because she simply could not endure the suspense anywhere else. The adventurous Stella picketed herself at a corner near the empty grocery which served as a polling booth for Subdivision 11, one of the most doubtful, but was forced to retire at the sight of the first carryall full of men from the Millburn Boiler Company, flaunting a banner inscribed, "We are solid for W.W." Met in the hall by her sister, she protested that she hadn't cried till she got inside the gate, anyhow. Abby lectured her soundly on the want of proper pride. She was much too big a girl to be seen around on a day when her brother was running, if it were only for school trustee. The other ladies of the family, having acquired proper pride, kept in the back of the house, so as not to be tempted to look out of the front windows. Mrs. Murchison assumed a stoical demeanour and made a pudding, though there was no reason to help Eliza, who was sufficiently lacking in proper pride to ask the milkman whether Lorne wasn't sure to be elected down there now. The milkman said he guessed the best man 'ud get in, but in a manner which roused general suspicion as to which he had himself favoured. "We'll finish the month," said Mrs. Murchison, "and then not another quart do we take from him, a gentleman that's so uncertain when he's asked a simple question." The butcher came and brought a jovial report without being asked for it, said he was the first man to hand in a paper at his place, but they were piling up there in great shape for Mr. Murchison when he left. "If he gets in, he gets in," said Mrs. Murchison, "and if he doesn't, it won't be because of not deserving to. Those were real nice cutlets yesterday, Mr. Price, and you had better send us a sirloin for tomorrow, about 6 pounds, but it doesn't matter to an ounce, and you can save us sweetbreads for Sunday. I like yours better than Luff's." John Murchison, Alick, and Oliver came shortly up to dinner, bringing stirring tales from the field. There was the personator in subdivision 6 of a dead man, a dead grit, wanted by the bloodhounds of the other side, and tracked to the Reform Committee room, where he was ostensibly and publicly taking refuge. "Why did he go there?" asked Stella breathlessly. "Why, to make it look like a put-up job of ours, of course," said her brother. "And it was a put-up job, a good old Tory fake, but they didn't calculate on Bingham and Bingham's memory. Bingham happened to be in the committee room, and he recognized this fellow for a regular political tough from up Muskoka way, where they get 6 for a bottle of Canadian and 10 if it's Scotch. 'Why, good morning,' says Bingham. 'Thought you were in jail.' And just then he catches sight of a couple of trailers from the window. Well, Bingham isn't just lightning smart, but then he isn't slow, you know. 'Well,' he says, 'you can't stop here.' And in another second he was throwing the fellow out. Threw him out pretty hard, too, I guess, right down the stairs, and Bingham on top. Met Winter's men at the door. 'The next time you want information from the headquarters of this association, gentlemen,' Bingham said, 'send somebody respectable.' Bingham thought the man was just any kind of low spy at first, but when they claimed him for personation, Bingham just laughed. 'Don't be so hard on your friends,' he said. I don't think we'll hear much more about that little racket." "Can't anything be done to any of them?" asked Stella. "Not today, of course, but when there's time?" "We'll have to see about it, Stella," said Alick, "when there's time." "Talking about Bingham," Oliver told them, "you know Bingham's story about Jim Whalen keeping sober for 2 weeks, for the first time in 20 years, to vote for Winter? Wouldn't touch a thing. No, he was going to do it this time if he died for it. It was disagreeable to refuse drinks, but it was going to be worth his while. Been boasting about the post office janitorship Winter was to give him if he got in. Well, in he came to number 11 this morning, all dressed up, with a clean collar, looking thirstier than any man you ever saw, and gets his paper. Young Charlie Bingham is deputy returning officer at number 11. In a second, back comes Whalen. 'This ballot's marked,' he says. 'You don't fool me.' 'Is it?' says Charlie, taking it out of his hand. 'That's very wrong, Jim. You shouldn't have marked it,' and drops it in the ballot box. Oh, Jim was wild. The paper had gone in blank, you see, and he'd lost all those good drunks and his vote, too. He was going to have Charlie's blood right away, but there it was, done. He'd handed in his ballot. He couldn't have another." They all laughed, I fear, at the unfortunate plight of the too suspicious Whalen. "Why did he think the ballot was marked?" asked Edwina. "Oh, there was a little smudge on it, a fly spot or something, Charlie says, but you couldn't fool Whalen." "I hope," said Stella meditatively, "that Lorne will get in by more than one. He wouldn't like to owe his election to a low-down trick like that." "Don't you be at all alarmed, you little girlish thing," replied her brother. "Lorne will get in by 500. John Murchison had listened to their excited talk, mostly in silence, going on with his dinner as if that and nothing else were the important matter of the moment. Mrs. Murchison had had this idiosyncrasy of his to put up with for over 30 years. She bore it now as long as she could. "Father!" she exploded at last. "Do you think Lorne will get in by 500?" Mr. Murchison shook his head, and bestowed his whole attention upon the paring of an apple. If he kept his hopes to himself, he also kept his doubts. "That remains to be seen," he said. "Well, considering it's your own son, I think you might show a little more confidence," said Mrs. Murchison. "No, thank you, no dessert for me. With a member of the family being elected, or not, for a seat in Parliament, I'm not the one to want dessert." Between Mr. Murchison and the milkman that morning, Mrs. Murchison felt almost too much tried by the superior capacity for reticence. It was 7 in the evening before the ballot boxes were all in the hands of the sheriff, and 9 before that officer found it necessary to let the town know that it had piled up a majority of 300 for Walter Winter. He was not a supporter of Walter Winter, and he preferred to wait until the returns began to come in from Clayfield and the townships, in the hope that they would make the serious difference that was required of them. The results were flashed, one after the other, to the total, from the windows of the Express and the Mercury, upon the cheering crowd that gathered in Market Square. There were moments of wild elation, moments of deep suspense upon both sides, but when the final addition and subtraction was made, the enthusiastic voters of South Fox, including Jim Whalen, who had neglected no further opportunity, read, with yells and groans, hurrahs and catcalls, that they had elected Mr. Lorne Murchison to the Dominion House of Commons by a majority of 70. Then the band began to play, and all the tin whistles to rejoice. Young and Windle had the grace to blow their sirens, and across the excited darkness of the town came the long familiar boom of the Murchison stove works. Every Liberal in Elgin who had any means of making a noise made it. From the window of the Association Committee room their young fellow townsman thanked them for the honour they had done him, while his mother sat in the cab he had brought her down in, and applauded vigorously between tears, and his father took congratulations from 100 friendly hands. They all went home in a torchlight procession, the band always playing, the tin whistles always performing, and it was 2 in the morning before the occasion could in any sense be said to be over. Lights burned quite as late, however, in the Conservative Committee room, where matters were being arranged to bark threateningly at the heels of victory next day. Victory looked like something that might be made to turn and parley. A majority of 70 was too small for finality. Her attention was called without 24 hours' delay to a paragraph in the Elgin Mercury, plainly authoritative, to the effect that the election of Mr. Murchison would be immediately challenged on the ground of the infringement in the electoral district of Moneda of certain provisions of the Ontario Elections Act, with the knowledge and consent of the candidate, whose claim to the contested seat, it was confidently expected, would be rendered, within a very short time, null and void. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Imperialist by Sara Jeannette Duncan. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. "You can never trust an Indian," said Mrs. Murchison at the anxious family council. Well do I remember them when you were a little thing at Vina, hanging round the town on a market day, and the squaws coming to the back door with their tin pails of raspberries to sell, and just knowing English enough to ask a big price for them. But it was on the squaws we depended in those days, or go without raspberry preserves for the winter. Slovenly looking things they were, with their 3 or 4 coloured petticoats, and their papooses on their backs, and for dirt. But I thought they were all gone long ago. There are enough of them left to make trouble, all right, said Alec. They don't dress up like they used to, and I guess they send the papooses to kindergarten now, but you'll find plenty of them lying around any time there's nothing to do but vote and get drunk. Allowing for the natural exaggeration of partisanship, the facts about the remaining red man of Moneda were much as Alec described them. On market days he slid easily, unless you looked twice, into what the Express continues to call the farming community. Invariably, if you did look twice, you would note that his stiff felt hat was an inch taller in the crown than those worn generally by the farming community, the pathetic assertion perhaps of an old sovereignty. Invariably, too, his coat and trousers betrayed a form within which, in the effort at adaptation, had become high-shouldered and lank of leg. And the brown skin was there to be noticed, though you might pass it by, and the high cheek-bones and the liquidly muddy eye. He had taken on the signs of civilization at the level which he occupied. The farming community had lent him its look of shrewdness in small bargains and its rakish sophistication in garments. Nor could you always assume with certainty, except at Fox County fairs and elections, that he was intoxicated. So much government had done for him in Fox County, where the reservation, nursing the dying fragment of his race, testified that there is such a thing as political compunction. Out in the wide spaces of the West he still protects his savagery. They know an Indian there today as far as they can see him, without a second glance. And in Moneda, upon polling days, he still, as Alex said, made trouble. Perhaps it would be more to the fact to say that he presented the elements of which trouble is made. Civilization had given him a vote, not with his coat and trousers, but shortly after, and he had not yet learned to keep it anywhere but in his pocket, whence the transfer was easy and could be made in different ways. The law contemplated only one, the straight drop into the ballot box, but the boys had other views. The law represented one level of political sentiment, the boys represented another. Both parties represented the law, both parties were represented by the boys, and on the occasion of the South Fox election the boys had been active in Moneda. There are, as we know, 2 kinds of activity on these occasions, one being set to observe the other. And Walter Winter's boys, while presumably neglecting no legitimate opportunity of their own, claimed to have been highly successful in detecting the methods of the other side. The Indians owed their holdings, their allowances, their school, and their protecting superintendent, Squire Ormiston, to a conservative government. It made a grateful bond, of which a later conservative government was not perhaps unaware when it added the ballot to its previous benefits. The Indians, therefore, on election days, were supposed to go solid for the candidate in whom they had been taught to see goodwill. If they did not go quite solid, the other side might point to the evolution of the political idea in every dissentient, a gladdening spectacle, indeed, on which, however, the other side seldom showed any desire to dwell. Hitherto the desires and intentions of the Reserve had been exemplified in its superintendent. Squire Ormiston had never led his wards to the polls. There were strong reasons against that. But the squire made no secret of his politics, either before or, unluckily, after he changed them. The Indians had always known that they were voting on the same side as the boss. They were likely, the friends of Mr. Winter thought, to know now that they were voting on a different side. This was the secret of Mr. Winter's friends' unusual diligence on voting day in Moneda. The mere indication of a wish on the part of the superintendent would constitute undue influence in the eye of the law. The squire was not the most discreet of men. Often before it had been the joke of conservative councils how near the old man had come to making a case for the Grits in connection with this chief or that. I will not say that he was acquainted with the famous letter from Queen Victoria, affectionately bidding her Indian children to vote for the Conservative candidate. But perhaps he had not adhered to the strictest interpretation of the law, which gave him fatherly influence in everything pertaining to his red-skinned charges' interests, temporal and spiritual, excepting only their sacred privilege of the ballot. He may even have held it in some genial derision, their sacred privilege. It would be natural, he had been there among them in unquestioned authority so long. Now it had assumed an importance. The squire looked at it with the ardour of a converted eye. When he told Mr. Farquharson that he could bring Moneda with him to a Liberal victory, he thought and spoke of the farmers of the township, not of his wards of the reserve. Yet as the day approached, these would infallibly become voters in his eyes, to swell or to diminish the sum of Moneda's loyalty to the empire. They remembered all this in the committee room of his old party. The squire, they said to one another, will give himself away this time, if ever he did. Then young Murchison hadn't known any better than to spend the best part of the day out there, and there were a dozen witnesses to swear that old Ormiston introduced him to 3 or 4 of the chiefs. That was basis enough for the boys detailed to watch Moneda, basis enough in the end for a petition constructed to travel to the High Court at Toronto for the purpose of rendering null and void the election of Mr. Lorne Murchison and transferring the South Fox seat to the candidate of the opposite party. That possibility had been promptly frustrated by a cross petition. There was enough evidence in subdivision 11, according to Bingham, to void the Tory returns on 6 different counts, but the house cat sold by Peter Finnegan to Mr. Winter for $5 would answer all practical purposes. It was a first-rate mouser, Bingham said, and it would settle Winter. They would have plenty of other charges good and ready if Finnegan's cat should fail them, but Bingham didn't think the court would get to anything else. He had great confidence in the cat. The petitions had been lodged with promptness. Evidence, as Mr. Winter remarked, is like a good many other things, better when it's hot, especially the kind you get on the reserve. To which, when he heard it, Bingham observed sarcastically that the cat would keep. The necessary $1,000 were ready on each side the day after the election, lodged in court the next. Counsel were as promptly engaged, the Liberals selected Cruikshank, and the suit against the elected candidate, beginning with charges against his agents in the town, was shortly in full hearing before the judges sent from Toronto to try it. Meanwhile, the Elgin Mercury had shown enterprise in getting hold of Moneda evidence, and foolhardiness, as the Express pointed out, in publishing it before the matter was reached in court. There was no foolhardiness in printing what the Express knew about Finnegan's cat. It was just a common cat, and Walter Winter paid $5 for it. Finnegan declaring that if Mr. Winter hadn't filled him up with bad whiskey before the bargain, he wouldn't have let her go under 10. He was that fond of the creature. The Express pointed out that this was grasping of Finnegan, as the cat had never left him, and Mr. Winter showed no intention of taking her away. But there was nothing sub judice about the cat. Finnegan, before he sobered up, had let her completely out of the bag. It was otherwise with the charges that were to be made, according to the Mercury, on the evidence of Chief Joseph Fry and another member of his tribe, to the effect that he and his conservative friends had been instructed by Squire Ormiston and Mr. Murchison to vote on this occasion for both the candidates, thereby producing, when the box was opened, 11 ballot papers inscribed with 2 crosses instead of 1, and valueless. Here, should the charges against a distinguished and highly respected government official fail, as in the opinion of the Express they undoubtedly would fail of substantiation, was a big libel case, all dressed and ready, and looking for the Mercury office. "Foolish, foolish," wrote Mr. Williams at the close of his editorial comments. "Very ill advised." "They've made no case so far," Mr. Murchison assured the family. "I saw Williams on my way up, and he says the evidence of that corner grocery fellow, what's his name, went all to pieces this morning. Oliver was in court. He says one of the judges, Hook, lost his patience altogether." "They won't do anything with the town charges," Alex said, "and they know it. They're saving themselves for Moneda and old man Ormiston." "Well, I heartily wish," said Mrs. Murchison, in a tone of grievance with the world at large, and if you were not responsible you might keep out of the way, "I heartily wish that Lorne had stayed at home that day and not got mixed up with old man Ormiston." "They'll find it pretty hard to fix anything on Lorne," said Alec, "but I guess the squire did go off his head a little." "Have they anything more than Indian evidence?" asked Edwina. "We don't know what they've got," said her brother darkly, "and we won't till Wednesday, when they expect to get round to it." "Indian evidence will be a poor dependence in Crookshank's hands," Mr. Murchison told them with a chuckle. "They say this Chief Joseph Fry is going about complaining that he always got $3 for 1 vote before, and this time he expected 6 for 2, and got nothing." "Chief Joseph Fry!" exclaimed Alec. "They make me tired with their Chief Josephs and Chief Henrys. White Clamshell, that was the name he got when he wasn't christened." "That's the name," remarked Edwina, "that he probably votes under." "Well," said Mrs. Murchison, "it was very kind of Squire Ormiston to give Lorne his support, but it seems to me that as far as Moneda is concerned, he would have done better alone." "No, I guess he wouldn't, mother," said Alec. "Moneda came right round with the squire, outside the reserve. If it hadn't been for the majority there, we would have lost the election. The old man worked hard, and Lorne is grateful to him, and so he ought to be." "If they carry the case against Lorne," said Stella, "he'll be disqualified for 7 years." "Only if they prove him personally mixed up in it," said the father. "And that," he added, with a concentration of family sentiment in the emphasis of it, "they'll not do." End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Imperialist by Sara Jeannette Duncan. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. It was late afternoon when the train from the west deposited Hugh Finlay upon the Elgin platform, the close of one of those wide, wet, uncertain February days, when the call of spring is on the wind, though spring is weeks away. The lights of the town flashed and glimmered down the streets under the bare, swaying maple branches. The early evening was full of soft bluster. The air was conscious with an appeal of nature, vague yet poignant. The young man caught at the strange sympathy that seemed to be abroad for his spirit. He walked to his house, courting it, troubled by it. They were expecting him that evening at Dr. Drummond's, and there it was his intention to go. But on his way he would call for a moment to see Edwina Murchison. He had something to tell her. It would be news of interest at Dr. Drummond's also, but it was of no consequence within an hour or so, when they should receive it there, while it was of great consequence that Edwina should hear it at the earliest opportunity, and from him. There is no weighing or analyzing the burden of such a necessity as this. It simply is important. It makes its own weight, and those whom it concerns must put aside other matters until it has been accomplished. He would tell her. They would accept it for a moment together, a moment during which he would also ascertain whether she was well and strong, with a good chance of happiness, God protect her, in the future that he should not know. Then he would go on to Dr. Drummond's. The wind had risen when he went out again. It blew a longer blast, and the trees made a steady, sonorous rhythm in it. The sky was full of clouds that dashed upon the track of a failing moon. There was portent everywhere, and a hint of tumult at the end of the street. No two ways led from Finley's house to his first destination. River Street made an angle with that on which the Murchisons lived, 1/2 a mile to the corner and 3/4 the other way. Drops drove in his face as he strode along against the wind, stilling his unquiet heart that leaped before him to that brief interview. As he took the single turning, he came into the full blast of the veering, irresolute storm. The street was solitary and full of the sound of the blown trees, wild and uplifting. Far down, the figure of a woman wavered before the wind across the zone of a blurred lamp-post. She was coming toward him. He bent his head and lowered his umbrella, and lost sight of her as they approached, she with the storm behind her, driven with hardly more resistance than the last year's blackened leaves that blew with her, he assailed by it, and making the best way he could. Certainly the wind was taking her part and his, when in another moment her skirt whipped against him, and he saw her face glimmer out. A mere wreck of lines and shadows it seemed in the livid light, with suddenly perceiving eyes and lips that cried his name. She had on a hat and a cloak, but carried no umbrella, and her hands were bare and wet. Pitifully the storm blew her into his arms, a tossed and straying thing that could not speak for sobs. Pitifully, and with a rough, incoherent sound, he gathered and held her in that refuge. A rising fear and a great solicitude laid a finger upon his craving embrace of her. He had a sense of something strangely different in her, of the unknown irremediable. Yet she was there, in his arms, as she had never been before. Her plight but made her, in a manner, sweeter. The storm that brought her barricaded them in the empty spaces of the street with a divinely entreating solitude. He had been prepared to meet her in the lighted decorum of her father's house, and he knew what he should say. He was not prepared to take her out of the tempest, helpless and weeping and lost for the harbour of his heart, and nothing could he say. He locked his lips against all that came murmuring to them, but his arms tightened about her, and he drew her into the shelter of a wall that jutted out in the irregular street, and there they stood and clung together in a long, close, broken silence that covered the downfall of her spirit. It was the moment of their great experience of one another. Never again, in whatever crisis, could either know so deep, so wonderful a fathoming of the other's soul. Once, as it passed, Edwina put up her hand and touched his cheek. There were tears on it, and she trembled and wound her arm about his neck and held up her face to his. "No," he muttered, and crushed it against his breast. There, without complaint, she let it lie. She was all submission to him. His blood leaped, and his spirit groaned with the knowledge of it. "Why did you come out? Why did you come, dear?" he said at last. "I don't know. There was such a wind, I could not stay in the house." She spoke timidly, in a voice that should have been new to him, but that it was, above all, her voice. "I was on my way to you." "I know. I thought you might perhaps come. If you had not, I think I was on my way to you." It seemed not unnatural. "Did you find any message from me when you came?" she asked presently, in a quieted, almost a contented tone. It shot, the message, before his eyes, though he had seen it no message in the preoccupation of his arrival. "I found a rose on my dressing-table," he told her, and the rose stood for him in a wonder of tenderness, looking back. "I smuggled it in," she confessed. "I knew your old servant. She used to be with us. The others, from Dr. Drummond's, have been there all day, making it warm and comfortable for you. I had no right to do anything like that, but I had the right, hadn't I, to bring the rose?" "I don't know," he answered her, hard-pressed, "how we are to bear this." She shrank away from him a little, as if at a glimpse of a surgeon's knife. "We are not to bear it," she said eagerly. "The rose is to tell you that. I didn't mean it, when I left it, to be anything more than a rose, but now I do. I didn't even know when I came out tonight, but now I do. We aren't to bear it, Hugh. I don't want it so, now. I can't have it so." She came nearer to him again and caught with her two hands the lapels of his coat. He closed his arm over them and looked down at her, in that half-detachment which still claimed and held her. "Edwina," he whispered, out of the sudden clamour in his mind. "She can't be... she isn't... nothing has happened to her?" She smiled faintly, but her eyes were again full of fear at his implication of the only way. "Oh no," she said. "But you have been away, and she has come. I have seen her, and oh, she won't care, Hugh. She won't care." Her asking, straining face seemed to gather and reflect all the light there was in the shifting night about them. The rain had stopped, but the wind still hurtled past, whirling the leaves from one darkness to another. They were as isolated, as outlawed there in the wild, wet wind, as they were in the confusion of their own souls. "We must care," he said helplessly, clinging to the sound and form of the words. "Oh no," she cried. "No, no. Indeed, I know now what is possible and what is not." For an instant her eyes searched the rigid lines of his face in astonishment. In their struggle to establish the impossible, she had been so far ahead, so greatly the more confident and daring, had tempted him to such heights, scorning every dizzy verge, that now, when she turned quite back from their adventure, humbly confessing it too hard, she could not understand how he should continue to set himself doggedly toward it. Perhaps, too, she trusted unconsciously in her prerogative. He loved her, and she him. Before, she would not. Now she would. Before, she had preferred an ideal to the desire of her heart. Now it lay about her. Her strenuous heart had pulled it down to foolish ruin, and how should she lie abased with it, and see him still erect and full of the deed they had to do? "Come," he said, "let me take you home, dear." And at that, and some accent in it that struck again at hope, she sank at his feet in a torrent of weeping, clasping them and entreating him, "Oh, send her away! Send her away!" He lifted her, and was obliged literally to support her. Her hat had fallen off. He stroked her hair, and murmured such comfort to her as we have for children in their extremity, of which the burden is chiefly love and "don't cry." She grew gradually quieter, drawing one knows not what restitution from the intrinsic in him, but there was no pride in her, and when she said, "Let me go home now," it was the broken word of hapless defeat. They struggled together out into the boisterous street, and once or twice she failed and had to stop and turn. Then she would cling to a wall or a tree, putting his help aside with a gesture in which there was again some pitiful trace of renunciation. They went almost without a word, each treading upon the heart of the other toward the gulf that was to come. They reached it at the Murchison's gate, and there they paused, as briefly as possible, since pause was torture, and he told her what he could not tell her before. "I have accepted the charge of the Whitewater Mission Station in Alberta," he said. "I, too, learned very soon after I left you what was possible and what was not. I go as soon as things can be set in order here. Goodbye, my dear love, and may God help us both." She looked at him with a pitiful effort at a steady lip. "I must try to believe it," she said. "And afterward, when it comes true for you, remember this: I was ashamed." Then he saw her pass into her father's house, and he took the road to his duty and Dr. Drummond's. His extremity was very great. Through it, lines came to him from the beautiful archaic inheritance of his church. He strode along, hearing them again and again in the dying storm. "So I do stretch my hands to thee, my help alone. Thou only understands all my complaint and moan." He listened to the prayer on the wind, which seemed to offer it for him, listened and was gravely touched. But he himself was far from the throes of supplication. He was looking for the forces of his soul, and by the time he reached Dr. Drummond's door, we may suppose that he had found them. Sara, who let him in, cried, "How wet you are, Mr. Finlay!" and took his overcoat to dry in the kitchen. The Scotch ladies, she told him, and Mrs. Forsyth, had gone out to tea, but they would be back right away, and meanwhile the doctor was expecting him in the study. He knew the way. Finlay did know the way, but, as a matter of fact, there had been time for him to forget it. He had not crossed Dr. Drummond's threshold since the night on which the doctor had done all, as he would have said, that was humanly possible to bring him, Finlay, to reason upon the matter of his incredible entanglement in dross. The door at the end of the passage was ajar, however, as if impatient, and Dr. Drummond himself, standing in it, heightened that appearance with his "Come you in, Finlay, come you in." The doctor looked at the young man in a manner even more acute, more shrewd, and more kindly than was his wont. His eye searched Finlay thoroughly, and his smile seemed to broaden as his glance travelled. "Man," he said, "you're shivering," and rolled him into an armchair near the fire. "The fellow came into the room," he would say, when he told the story afterward to the person most concerned, "as if he were going to the stake. This is extraordinary weather we are having, but I think the storm is passing over." "I hope," said Finlay, "that my aunt and Miss Cameron are well. I understand they are out." "Oh, very well. Finely. They're out at present, and you'll see them by and by. An excellent voyage over they had, just the 8 days. But we'll be doing it in less than that when the new fast line is running to Halifax. But 4 days of actual ocean travelling, they say now it will take. 4 days from Imperial shore to shore. That should incorporate us, that should bring them out and take us home." The doctor had not taken a seat himself, but was pacing the study, his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets, and a touch of embarrassment seemed added to the inveterate habit. "I hear the ladies had pleasant weather," Finlay remarked. "Capital, capital. You won't smoke? I know nothing about these cigars. There's some Grant left behind him. A chimney, that man Grant. Well, Finlay," he threw himself into the armchair on the other side of the hearth, "I don't know what to say to you." "Surely," said Finlay restively, "it has all been said, sir." "No, it has not all been said," Dr. Drummond retorted. "No, it has not. There's more to be said, and you must hear it, Finlay, with such patience as you have. But I speak the truth when I say that I don't know how to begin." The young man gave him opportunity, gazing silently into the fire. He was hardly aware that Dr. Drummond had again left his seat, when he started violently at a clap on the shoulder. "Finlay," exclaimed the doctor, "you won't be offended. No, you couldn't be offended." It was half jocular, half anxious, wholly inexplicable. "At what," asked Hugh Finlay, "should I be offended?" Again, with a deep sigh, the doctor dropped into his chair. "I see I must begin at the beginning," he said. But Finlay, with sudden intuition, had risen and stood before him trembling, with a hand against the mantelpiece. "No," he said, "if you have anything to tell me of importance, for God's sake, begin at the end." Some vibration in his voice went straight to the heart of the doctor, banishing as it travelled every irrelevant thing that it encountered. "Then the end is this, Finlay," he said. "The young woman, Miss Christy Cameron, whom you were so wilfully bound and determined to marry, has thrown you over, that is, if you will give her back her word, has jilted you, that is, if you'll let her away, has thought entirely better of the matter." He stared out of his great sockets of eyes as if the sky had fallen, Dr. Drummond would say, recounting it. For what reason?" asked Finlay, hardly yet able to distinguish between the sound of disaster and the sense that lay beneath. "May I begin at the beginning?" asked the doctor, and Hugh silently nodded. "He sat there and never took his eyes off me, twisting his fingers. I might have been in a confession box," Dr. Drummond would explain to her. "She came here, Miss Cameron, with that good woman, Mrs. Kilbannon. It will be 3 weeks next Monday," he said, with all the air of beginning a story that would be well worth hearing. "And I wasn't very well pleased to see her, for reasons that you know. However, that's neither here nor there. I met them both at the station, and I own to you that I thought, when I made Miss Cameron's acquaintance, that you were getting better than you deserved in the circumstances. You were 1,000 miles away, now that was a fortunate thing, and she and Mrs. Kilbannon just stayed here and made themselves as comfortable as they could, and that was so comfortable that any one could see with half an eye," the doctor's own eye twinkled, "so far as Miss Cameron was concerned, that she wasn't pining in any sense of the word. But I wasn't sorry for you, Finlay, on that account." He stopped to laugh enjoyingly, and Finlay blushed like a girl. "I just let matters bide and went about my own business. though after poor Mrs. Forsyth here, a good woman enough, but the brains of a rabbit, it was pleasant to find these intelligent ladies at every meal, and wonderful how quick they were at picking up the differences between the points of church administration here and at home. That was a thing I noticed particularly in Miss Cameron. Matters went smoothly enough, till one afternoon that foolish creature Edwina Murchison, Finlay started, came here to pay a call on Miss Cameron and Mrs. Kilbannon. It was well and kindly meant, but it was not a wise-like thing to do. I didn't exactly make it out, but it seems that she came all because of you and on account of you, and the ladies didn't understand it, and Mrs. Kilbannon came to me. My word, but there was a woman to deal with! Who was this young lady, and what was she to you that she should go anywhere or do anything in your name? Without doubt," he put up a staying hand, "it was foolish of Edwina. And what sort of freedom, and how far, and why, and what way? And I tell you, it was no easy matter to quiet her." "Is Miss Cameron distressed about it?" said I. "Not a bit," said she, "but I am, and I must have the rights of this matter," said she, "if I have to put it to my nephew himself." It was at that point, Finlay, that the idea, just then that the thought came into my mind, well, I won't say absolutely, but practically for the first time, why can't this matter be arranged on a basis to suit all parties? So I said to her, "Mrs. Kilbannon," I said, "if you had reasonable grounds for it, do you think you could persuade your niece not to marry Hugh Finlay? Wait, Patience." He held up his hand, and Finlay gripped the arm of his chair again. She just stared at me. "Are you gone clean daft, Dr. Drummond?" she said. "There could be no grounds serious enough for that. I will not believe that Hugh Finlay has compromised himself in any way." I had to stop her. I was obliged to tell her there was nothing of the kind, nothing of the kind. And later on I'll have to settle with my conscience about that. I meant, I said, the reasonable grounds of an alternative. "An alternative?" said she. "To cut a long story short," continued the doctor, leaning forward, always with the finger in his waistcoat pocket to emphasize what he said, "I represented to Mrs. Kilbannon that Miss Cameron was not in sentimental relations towards you, that she had some reason to suspect you of having placed your affections elsewhere, and that I myself was very much taken up with what I had seen of Miss Cameron. In brief, I said to Mrs. Kilbannon that if Miss Cameron saw no objection to altering the arrangements to admit of it, I should be pleased to marry her myself. The thing was much more suitable in every way. I was 53 years of age last week, I told her, but, I said, Miss Cameron is 36 or 7 if she's a day, and Finlay there would be like nothing but a grown-up son to her. I can offer her a good home and the minister's pew in a church that any woman might be proud of. And though far be it from me, I said, to depreciate mission work, either home or foreign, Miss Cameron in that field would be little less than thrown away. Think it over, I said. Well, she was pleased, I could see that, but she didn't half like the idea of changing the original notion. It was leaving you to your own devices that weighed most with her against it. She'd set her heart on seeing you married with her approval. So I said to her, to make an end of it, "Well, Mrs. Kilbannon," I said, "suppose we say no more about it for the present. I think I see the finger of Providence in this matter, but you'll talk it over with Miss Cameron, and we'll all just make it, for the next few days, the subject of quiet and sober reflection. Maybe at the end of that time I'll think better of it myself, though that is not my expectation." "I think," she said, "we'll just leave it to Christie." As the doctor went on with his tale, relaxation had stolen dumbly about Finlay's brow and lips. He dropped from the plane of his own absorption to the humorous common sense of the recital. It claimed and held him with infinite solace. His eyes had something like the light of laughter in them, flashing behind a cloud, as he fixed them on Dr. Drummond, and said, "And did you?" "We did," said Dr. Drummond, getting up once more from his chair, and playing complacently with his watch charms as he took another turn about the study. "We left it to Miss Cameron, and the result is—" The doctor stopped sharply and wheeled round upon Finlay. "The result is, why, the upshot seems to be that I've cut you out, man." Finlay measured the little doctor standing there twisting his watch chain, beaming with achieved satisfaction, in a consuming desire to know how far chance had been kind to him, and how far he had to be simply unspeakably grateful. He stared in silence, occupied with his great debt. It was like him that that, and not his liberty, should be first in his mind. We who have not his opportunity may find it more difficult to decide, but from our private knowledge of Dr. Drummond, we may remember what poor Finlay probably forgot at the moment, that even when pitted against Providence, the doctor was a man of great determination. The young fellow got up, still speechless, and confronted Dr. Drummond. He was troubled for something to say. The chambers of his brain seemed empty, or reiterating foolish sounds. He pressed the hand the minister offered him, and his lips quivered. Then a light came into his face, and he picked up his hat. "And I'll say this for myself," chuckled Dr. Drummond, "it was no hard matter." Finlay looked at him and smiled. "It would not be, sir," he said lamely. Dr. Drummond cast a shrewd glance at him, and dropped the tone of banter. "Ay, I know, it's no joking matter," he said, and with a hand behind the young man's elbow, he half pushed him to the door, and took out his watch. He must always be starting somebody, something, in the right direction, the doctor. "It's not much after 9:30, Finlay," he said. "I notice the stars are out." It had the feeling of a colloquial benediction, and Finlay carried it with him all the way. It was nevertheless nearly 10 when he reached her father's house, so late that the family had dispersed for the night. Yet he had the hardihood to ring, and the hour blessed them both, for Edwina on the stair, catching who knows what of presage out of the sound, turned and found him at the threshold herself. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Imperialist by Sara Jeannette Duncan. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. "I understand how you must feel in the matter, Murchison," said Henry Cruikshank. "It's the most natural thing in the world that you should want to clear yourself definitely, especially, as you say, since the charges have been given such wide publicity. On the other hand, I think it quite possible that you exaggerate the inference that will be drawn from our consenting to saw off with the other side on the two principal counts." "The inference will be," said Lorne, "that there's not a pin to choose between Winter's political honesty and my own. I'm no Pharisee, but I don't think I can sit down under that. I can't impair my possible usefulness by accepting a slur upon my reputation at the very beginning." "Politics are very impersonal. It wouldn't be remembered a year." "Winter, of course," said young Murchison, moodily, "doesn't want to take any chances. He knows he's done for if we go on. 7 years for him would put him pretty well out of politics, and it would suit him down to the ground to fight it over again. There's nothing he would like better to see than another writ for South Fox." "That's all right," the lawyer responded, "but Moneda doesn't look altogether pleasant, you know. We may have good grounds for supposing that the court will find you clear of that business, but Ormiston, so far as I can make out, was playing the fool down there for a week before polling day, and there are 3 or 4 yellow dogs and red feathers only too anxious to pay back a grudge on him. We'll have to fight again, there's no doubt about that. The only question is whether we'll ruin Ormiston first or not. Have you seen Bingham?" "I know what Bingham thinks," said Lorne, impatiently. "The squire's position is a different consideration. I don't see how I can. However, I'll go across to the committee room now and talk it over." It is doubtful whether young Murchison knew all that Bingham thought. Bingham so seldom told it all. There were matters in the back of Bingham's mind that prompted him to urge the course that Cruikshank had been empowered by the opposing counsel to suggest, party considerations that it would serve no useful purpose to talk over with Murchison. Bingham put it darkly when he said he had quite as much hay on his fork as he cared to tackle already, implying that the defense of indiscretions on Moneda was quite an unnecessary addition. Contingencies seemed probable, arising out of the Moneda charges, that might affect the central organization of the party in South Fox to an extent wholly out of proportion with the mere necessity of a second election. Bingham talked it over with Horace Williams, and both of them with Farquharson. They were all there to urge the desirability of sawing off upon Lorne when he found them at headquarters. Their most potent argument was, of course, the squire, and the immediate dismissal that awaited him under the law if undue influence were proved against him. Other considerations found the newly elected member for South Fox obstinate and troublesome, but to that he was bound to listen, and before that he finally withdrew his objections. The election would come on again, as happened commonly enough. Bingham could point to the opening in a few days of a big flour milling industry across the river, which would help. Operations on the drill hall and the post office would be hurried on at once, and the local party organization would be thoroughly overhauled. Bingham had good reason for believing that they could entirely regain their lost ground, and at the same time dissipate the dangerous impression that South Fox was being undermined. Their candidate gave a reluctant ear to it all, and in the end agreed to everything. So that Chief Joseph Fry, the white clamshell of his own lost fires, was never allowed the chance of making good the election losses of that year, as he had confidently expected to do when the charge came on. Nor was it given to any of the yellow dogs and red feathers of Mr. Cruikshank's citation to boast at the tribal dog feasts of the future of the occasion on which they had bested de Boss. Neither was any further part in public affairs, except by way of jocular reference, assigned to Finnegan's cat. The proceedings of the court abruptly terminated, the judges reported the desirability of a second contest, and the public accepted with a wink. The wink in any form was hateful to Lorne Murchison, but he had not to encounter it long. The young man had changed in none of the aspects he presented to his fellow citizens since the beginning of the campaign. In the public eye he wore the same virtues as he wore the same clothes. He summed up even a greater measure of success. His popularity was unimpaired. He went as keenly about the business of life, handling its details with the same capable old drawl. Only his mother, with the divination of mothers, declared that since the night of the Opera House meeting, Lorne had been all worked up. She watched him with furtive, anxious looks, was solicitous about his food, expressed relief when she knew him to be safely in bed and asleep. He himself observed himself with discontent, unable to fathom his extraordinary lapse from self-control on the night of his final address. He charged it to the strain of unavoidable office work on top of the business of the campaign, abused his nerves, talked of a few days' rest when they had settled winter. He could think of nothing but the points he had forgotten when he had his great chance. "The flag should have come in at the end," he would say to himself, trying vainly to remember where it did come in. He was ill pleased with the issue of that occasion, and it was small compensation to be told by Stella that his speech gave her shivers up and down her back. Meanwhile, the theory of empire coursed in his blood, fed by the revelation of the future of his country in every newspaper, by the calculated prophecies of American onlookers, and by the telegrams which repeated the trumpet notes of Wallingham's war upon the mandarinate of Great Britain. It occupied him so that he began to measure and limit what he had to say about it, and to probe the casual eye for sympathy before he would give an inch of rope to his enthusiasm. He found it as hard as ever to understand that the public interest should be otherwise preoccupied, as it plainly was, that the party organ, terrified of Quebec, should shuffle away from the subject with perfunctory and non-committal reference, that among the men he met in the street nobody's blood seemed stirred, whatever the day's news was from England. He subscribed to the Toronto Post, the leading organ of the Tories, because of its fuller reports and more sympathetic treatment of the idea, due to the fact that the idea originated in a brain temporarily affiliated to the Conservative Party. If the departure to imperial preference had any damage in it for Canadian interests, it would be for those which the Post made its special care. But the spirit of party draws the breath of expediency, and the Post, flaunting the Union Jack every other day, put secondary manufactures aside for future discussion, and tickled the wheat growers with the 2-shilling advantage they were coming into at the hands of the English Conservatives, until Liberal leaders began to be a little anxious about a possible loss of wheat-growing votes. It was, as John Murchison said, a queer position for everybody concerned. Queer enough, no doubt, to admit a Tory journal into the House on sufferance and as a special matter, but he had a disapproving look for it as it lay on the hall floor, and seldom was the first to open it. Nevertheless, Lorne found more satisfaction in talking imperialism with his father than with anyone else. While the practical half of John Murchison was characteristically alive to the difficulties involved, the sentimental half of him was ready at any time to give out cautious sparks of sympathy with the splendor of Wallingham's scheme, and he liked the feeling that a son of his should hark back in his allegiance to the old land. There was a kind of chivalry in the placing of certain forms of beauty, political honor and public devotion, which blossomed best, it seemed, over there, above the material ease and margin of the new country, and even above the grand chance it offered for a man to make his mark. Mr. Murchison was susceptible to this in anyone, and responsive to it in his son. As to the local party leaders, they had little more than a shrug for the subject. So far as they were concerned, there was no empire and no idea. Wallingham might as well not have been born. It seemed to Lorne that they maintained toward him personally a special reticence about it. Reticence, indeed, characterized their behavior generally during the period between the abandonment of the suits and the arrangement of the Second Liberal Convention. They had little advice for him about his political attitude, little advice about anything. He noticed that his presence on one or two occasions seemed to embarrass them, and that his arrival would sometimes have a disintegrating effect upon a group in the post office or at a street corner. He added it, without thinking, to his general heaviness. They held it a good deal against him, he supposed, to have reduced their proud standing majority to a beggarly 2 figures. He didn't blame them. I cannot think that the sum of these depressions alone would have been enough to overshadow so buoyant a soul as Lorne Murchison's. The characteristics of him I have tried to convey were grafted on an excellent fund of common sense. He was well aware of the proportions of things. He had no despair of the idea, nor would he despair should the idea etherealize and fly away. Neither had he, for his personal honor, any morbid desires toward white clam shell or Finnegan's cat. His luck had been a good deal better than it might have been. He recognized that as fully as any sensible young man could, and as for the great chance and the queer grip it had on him, he would have argued that too if anyone had approached him curiously about it. There, I think, we might doubt his conclusions. There is nothing subtler, more elusive to trace, than the intercurrents of the emotions. Politics and love are thought of at opposite poles, and Walsingham perhaps would have laughed to know that he owed an exalted allegiance in part to a half-broken heart. Yet the impulse that is beyond our calculation, the thing we know potential in the blood but not to be summoned or conditioned, lies always in the shadow of the ideal. And who can analyze that and say, of this class is the will to believe in the integrity of the beloved and false, of that is the desire to lift a nation to the level of its mountain ranges. Both dispositions have a tendency to overwork the heart, and it is easy to imagine that they might interact. Lorne Murchison's wish, which was indeed a burning longing and necessity, to believe in the Dora Milburn of his passion, had been under a strain since the night on which he brought her the pledge which she refused to wear. He had been hardly conscious of it in the beginning, but by constant suggestion it had grown into his knowledge, and for weeks he had taken poignant account of it. His election had brought him no nearer a settlement with her objection to letting the world know of their relations. The immediate announcement that it was to be disputed gave Dora another chance, and once again postponed the assurance that he longed for with a fever which was his own condemnation of her, if he could have read that sign. For months he had seen so little of her, had so altered his constant habit of going to the Milburns, that his family talked of it, wondering among themselves, and Stella indulged in hopeful speculations. They did not wonder or speculate at the Milburns. It was an axiom there that it is well to do nothing rashly. Lorne, in the office on Market Street, had been replying to Mr. Fulke to the effect that the convention could hardly be much longer postponed, but that as yet he had heard no word of the date of it, when the telephone bell rang, and Mr. Farquharson's voice at the other end asked him to come over to the committee room. "They've decided about it now, I imagine," he told his senior, putting on his hat, and something of the wonted fighting elation came upon him as he went down the stairs. He was right in his supposition. They had decided about it, and they were waiting, in a group that made every effort to look casual, to tell him when he arrived. They had delegated what Horace Williams called the job to Mr. Farquharson, and he was actually struggling with the preliminaries of it, when Bingham, uncomfortable under the curious quietude of the young fellow's attention, burst out with the whole thing. "The fact is, Murchison, you can't poll the vote. There's no man in the riding we'd be better pleased to send to the House, but we've got to win this election, and we can't win it with you." "You think you can't?" said Lorne. "You see, old man," Horace Williams put in, "you didn't get rid of that save the empire or die scheme of yours soon enough. People got to think you meant something by it." "I shall never get rid of it," Lorne returned simply, and the others looked at one another. "The popular idea seems to be," said Mr. Farquharson judicially, "that you would not hesitate to put Canada to some material loss, or at least to postpone her development in various important directions, for the sake of the imperial connection." "Wasn't that," Lorne asked him, "what 6 months ago you were all prepared to do?" "Oh, no," said Bingham, with the air of repudiating for everybody concerned. "Not for a cent. We were willing at one time to work it for what it was worth, but it was never worth that, and if you'd had a little more experience, Murchison, you'd have realized it." "That's right, Lorne," contributed Horace Williams. "Experience, that's all you want. You've got everything else and a darn sight more. We'll get you there all in good time, but this time—" "You want me to step down and out," said Lorne. "That's for you to say," Bingham told him. "We can nominate you again, all right, but we're afraid we can't get you the convention. Young and Windle have been working like moles for the past 10 days." "For Carter?" interrupted Lorne. "Carter, of course." They nodded. Carter stood the admitted fact. "I'm sorry it's Carter," said Lorne thoughtfully. "However—" and he dropped, staring before him, into silence. The others eyed him from serious, underhung faces. Horace Williams, with an obvious effort, got up and clapped him on the shoulder. "Brace up, old chap," he said. "You made a blame good fight for us, and we'll do the same for you another day. However, gentlemen," the young man gathered himself up to say, "I believe I understand the situation. You are my friends, and this is your advice. We must save the seat. I'll see Carter. If I can get anything out of him to make me think he'll go straight on the scheme to save the empire," he smiled faintly, "when it comes to a vote, I'll withdraw in his favor at the convention. Horace here will think up something for me. Any old lie will do, I suppose. In any case, of course, I withdraw." He took up his hat, and they all got up, startled a little at the quick and simple close of the difficult scene they had anticipated. Horace Williams offered his hand. "Shake, Lorne," he said, and the other two, coming nearer, followed his example. "Why, yes," said Lorne. He left them with a brief excuse, and they stood together in a moment's silence, three practical politicians who had delivered themselves from a dangerous network involving higher things. "Dash these heart-to-heart talks," said Bingham irritably. "It's the only thing to do, but why the devil didn't he want something out of it? I had that registrarship in my inside pocket." "If anybody likes to kick me round the room," remarked Horace Williams with depression, "I have no very strong objection." "And now," Mr. Farquharson said with a sigh, "we understand it's got to be Carter. I suppose I'm too old a man to do jockey for a 3-year-old, but I own I've enjoyed the ride." Lorne Murchison went out into the companionship of Main Street, the new check in his fortunes hanging before him. We may imagine that it hung heavily. We may suppose that it cut off the view. As Bingham would have said, he was up against it, and that, when one is confidently treading the straight path to accomplishment, is a dazing experience. He was up against it, yet already he had recoiled far enough to consider it. Already he was adapting his heart, his nerves, and his future to it. His heart took it greatly, told him he had not yet force enough for the business he had aspired to, but gave him a secret assurance. Another time he would find more strength and show more cunning. He would not disdain the tools of diplomacy and desirability. He would dream no more of short-cuts in great political departures. His heart bowed to its sorry education, and took counsel with him, bidding him be of good courage and push on. He was up against it, but he would get round it, and there, on the other side, lay the same wide prospect, with the idea shining high. At one point he faltered, but that was a matter of expediency rather than of courage. He searched and selected, as he went along the street, among phrases that would convey his disaster to Dora Milburn. Just at that point, the turning to his own office, he felt it hard luck that Alfred Hesketh should meet and want a word with him. Hesketh had become tolerable only when other things were equal. Lorne had not seen him since the night of his election, when his felicitations had seemed to stand for very little one way or another. His manner now was more serious, charged with other considerations. Lorne waited on the word, uncomfortably putting off the necessity of coming out with his misfortune. "I haven't come across you, Murchison, but you've had my sympathy, I needn't say, all this time. A man can't go into politics with gloves on, there's no doubt about that. Though, mind you, I never for a moment believed that you let yourself in personally. I mean, I've held you all through above the faintest suspicion." "Have you?" said Lorne. "Well, I suppose I ought to be grateful." "Oh, I have, I assure you. But give me a disputed election for the revelation of a rotten state of things, eh?" "It does show up pretty low, doesn't it?" "However, upon my word, I don't know whether it's any better in England. At bottom, we've got a lower class to deal with, you know. I'm beginning to have a great respect for the electorate of this country, Murchison. Not necessarily the methods, but the rank and file of the people. They know what they want, and they're going to have it." "Yes," said Lorne, "I guess they are." "And that brings me to my news, old man. I've given the matter a lot of time and a lot of consideration, and I've decided that I can't do better than drive in a stake for myself in this new country of yours." "It isn't so very new," Lorne told him in rather dull response, "but I expect that's a pretty good line to take. Why, yes, first rate." "As to the line," Hesketh went on weightily, leading the way through an encumbering group of farmers at a corner, "I've selected that too. Traction engines. Milburn has never built them yet, but he says the opportunity is ripe." "Milburn?" Lorne wheeled sharply. "My future partner. He was planning extensions just as I came along, a fortunate moment I hope it will prove for us both. I'd like to go into it with you some time when you have leisure. It's a scheme of extraordinary promise. By the way, there's an idea in it that ought to appeal to you, driving the force that's to subdue this wilderness of yours." "When you've lived here for a while," said Lorne, painfully preoccupied, "you'll think it quite civilized. So you're going in with Milburn?" "Oh, I'm proud of it already. I shall make a good Canadian, I trust, and as good an Imperialist," he added, "as is consistent with the claims of my adopted country." "That seems to be the popular view," said Lorne. "And a very reasonable view, too. But I'm not going to embark on that with you, old fellow. You shan't draw me in. I know where you are on that subject." "So do I. I'm stranded, but it's all right. The subject isn't," Lorne said quietly, and Hesketh's exclamations and inquiries brought out the morning's reverse. The young Englishman was cordially sorry, full of concern and personal disappointment, abandoning his own absorbing affairs, and devoting his whole attention to the unfortunate exigency which Lorne dragged out of his breast, in pure manfulness, to lay before him. However, they came to the end of it, arriving at the same time at the door which led up the stairs to the office of Fulke, Warner and Murchison. "Thank you," said Lorne. "Thank you. Oh, I dare say it will come all right in the course of time. You return to England, I suppose, or do you, before you go in with Milburn?" "I sail next week," said Hesketh, and a great relief shot into the face of his companion. I have a good deal to see to over there. I shan't get back much before June, I fancy. And I must tell you, I am doing the thing very thoroughly. This business of naturalizing myself, I mean. I am going to marry that very charming girl, a great friend of yours, by the way, I know her to be, Miss Milburn. For accepting the strokes of fate, we have curiously trivial demonstrations. Lorne met Hesketh's eye with the steadiness of a lion's in his own. The unusual thing he did was to take his hands out of his pockets and let his arms hang loosely by his side. It was as tragic a gesture of helplessness as if he had flung them above his head. "Dora is going to marry you?" "I believe she will do me that honour, and I consider it an honour. Miss Milburn will compare with any English girl I ever met. But I half expected you to congratulate me. I know she wrote to you this morning. You were one of the first." "I shall probably find the letter," said Lorne mechanically, "when I go home." He still eyed Hesketh narrowly, as if he had somewhere concealed about him the explanation of this final bitter circumstance. He had a desire not to leave him. To stand and parley, to go upstairs to the office, would be to plunge into the gulf. He held back from that, and leaned against the door frame, crossing his arms and looking over into the marketplace for subjects to postpone Hesketh's departure. They talked of various matters in sight, Hesketh showing the zest of his newly determined citizenship in every observation, the extension of the electric tramway, the pulling down of the old fire hall. In one consciousness, Lorne made concise and relevant remarks. In another, he sat in a spinning, dark world, and waited for the crash. It seemed to come when Hesketh said, preparing to go, "I'll tell Miss Milburn I saw you. I suppose this change in your political prospects won't affect your professional plans in any way. You'll stick on here, at the bar." It was the very shock of calamity, and for the instant he could see nothing in the night of it but one far avenue of escape, a possibility he had never thought of seriously until that moment. The conception seemed to form itself on his lips, to be involuntary. "I don't know. A college friend has been pressing me for some time to join him in Milwaukee. He offers me plenty of work, and I am thinking seriously of closing with him." "Go over to the United States? You can't mean that." "Oh, yes, it's the next best thing." Hesketh's face assumed a gravity, a look of feeling and of remonstrance. He came a step nearer and put a hand on his companion's arm. "Come now, Murchison," he said, "I ask you, is this a time to be thinking of chucking the Empire?" Lorne moved further into the passage with an abruptness which left his interlocutor staring. He stood there for a moment in silence, and then turned to mount the stair, with a reply which a passing dray happily prevented from reaching Hesketh's ears. "No, damn you," he said, "it's not." I cannot let him finish on that uncontrolled phrase, though it will be acknowledged that his provocation was great. Nor must we leave him in heavy captivity to the thought of oblivion in the unregarding welter of the near republic, of plunging into more strenuous activities and abandoning his ideal, in queer inverted analogy to the refuging of weak women in a convent. We know that his ideal was strong enough to reassert itself, under a keen irony of suggestion, in the very depth of his overwhelming; and the thing that could rise in him at that black moment may be trusted, perhaps, to reclaim his fortitude and reconsecrate his energy when these things come again into the full current of his life. The illness that, after 2 or 3 lagging days, brought him its merciful physical distraction, was laid, in the general understanding, at the door of his political disappointment. and among a crowd of sympathizers confined to no party, Horace Williams, as his wife expressed it, was pretty nearly wild during its progress. The power of the press is regrettably small in such emergencies, but what restoration it had, Horace anxiously administered. The Express published a daily bulletin. The second election passed only half noticed by the Murchison family. Carter very nearly re-established the Liberal majority. The Dominion dwelt upon this repeated demonstration of the strength of reform principles in South Fox, and Mrs. Murchison said they were welcome to Carter. Many will sympathize with Mrs. Murchison at this point, I hope, and regret to abandon her in such equivocal approval of the circumstances which have arisen round her. Too anxiously occupied at home to take her share in the general pleasant sensation of Dr. Drummond's marriage, she was compelled to give it a hurried consideration and a sanction which was practically wrested from her. She could not be clear as to the course of events that led to it, nor entirely satisfied, as she said, about the ins and outs of the affair. This, although she felt she could be clearer, and possibly had better grounds for being satisfied than other people. As to Edwina's simple statement that Miss Cameron had made a second choice of the doctor, changing her mind, as far as Mrs. Murchison could see, without rhyme or reason, that Mrs. Murchison took leave to find a very poor explanation. Edwina's own behaviour toward the rejection is one of the things which her mother declares, probably truly, that she never will understand. To pick up a man in the actual fling of being thrown over will never, in Mrs. Murchison's eyes, constitute a decorous proceeding. I suppose she thinks the creature might have been made to wait, at least, until he had found his feet. She professes to cherish no antagonism to her future son-in-law on this account, although, as she says, it's a queer way to come into a family, and she makes no secret of her belief that Miss Cameron showed excellent judgment in doing as she did, however that far-seeing woman came to have the opportunity. Hesketh had sailed before Lorne left his room, to return in June to those privileges and prospects of citizenship which he so eminently deserves to enjoy. When her brother's convalescence and departure for Florida had untied her tongue, Stella widely proclaimed her opinion that Mr. Hesketh's engagement to Miss Milburn was the most suitable thing that could be imagined or desired. We know the youngest Miss Murchison to be inclined to impulsive views, but it would be safe, I think, to follow her here. Now that the question no longer circles in the actual vortex of Elgin politics, Mr. Octavius Milburn's attitude toward the conditions of imperial connection has become almost as mellow as ever. Circumstances may arise any day, however, to stir up that latent bitterness which is so potential in him, and then, I fear, there will be no restraining him from again attacking Wallingham in the papers. Henry Cruikshank, growing old in his eminence, and less secure, perhaps, in the increasing conflict of loud voices, of his own grasp of the ultimate best, fearing, too, no doubt, the approach of that cynicism which, moral or immoral, is the real horror of age, wrote to young Murchison, while he was still examining the problems of the United States with the half-heart of the alien, and offered him a partnership. The terms were so simple and advantageous as only to be explicable on the grounds I have mentioned, though no phrase suggested them in the brief formulas of the letter, in which one is tempted to find the individual parallel of certain propositions of a great government also growing old. The offer was accepted, not without emotion, and there too it would be good to trace the parallel, were we permitted, but for that it is too soon, or perhaps it is too late. Here, for Lorne and for his country, we lose the thread of destiny. The shuttles fly. weaving the will of the nations, with a skein forever dipped again; and he goes forth to his share in the task, among those by whose hand and direction the pattern and the colors will be made. End of Chapter 33. End of The Imperialist by Sara Jeannette Duncan.